is a strong and mighty fortress. Raise your voice now. No love is greater. Who can stand against us if our God is for us? Even when I stumble, even when I fall, even when I turn back, still your love is sure. You will not abandon, you will not forsake. You will cheer me onward with never-ending grace. Sing with joy now, our God is for us. The Father's love is a strong and mighty fortress. Raise your voice now, no love is greater. Who can stand against us if our God is for us? Neither height nor depth can separate us. Hell and death will not defeat us. He who gave his Son to free us holds me in his love. Neither height nor depth can separate us. Hell and death will not defeat us. He who gave his Son to free us holds me in his love. Sing with joy now, our God is for us. The Father's love is a strong and mighty fortress. Raise your voice now, no love is greater. Who can stand against us if our God is for us? Sing with joy now, our God is for us. The Father's love is a strong and mighty fortress. Raise your voice now, no love is greater. Who can stand against us if our God is for us?
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in today. I'm David Robinson, and I want to make sure you're aware about something coming up next week on the first weekend of May during our services. We've got a counselor who's going to be with us and will speak with us that day. It's kind of like it's Ask Counselor Sunday at CCC. And if you could ask a professional Christian counselor any question, any question at all, you personally, what would you ask? What would you want to hear from them about? And if you're willing, we'd love for you to text that question to 410-849-6265 and just send in what you'd like to hear about, if you're up for that. All right. So that's next week. But today we're wrapping up a series called Prodigal. We've been mining Jesus' most revered and most famous story that he ever told. Many refer to it as the most famous story in the entire world ever. It's the story of a father and two sons. It's found in the 15th chapter of the Gospel of Luke in the Bible. And for centuries, it's been called by a certain title, the parable of the prodigal son, referring to the younger son. But it's a great mistake to think this is a story about one son and one son only. It's a story of two sons. And it's not just a story about two sons, but it's also a story about a father. You see, it's a story as much about the older son as it is the younger son, and it's a story as much about the father as it is the sons. It might be better titled, The Story About the Father of Two Bad Sons. And we're meant to compare and contrast them all. And if we do, we'll see the radical message Jesus is saying through this message of this great story. Now, let's make sure we're all on the same page with the basic gist of this story, and then we'll step back and talk about some overarching things to grab onto out of it. The story takes place in two acts. Act 1, the title of which is The Lost Younger Brother, and we explored Act 1 in week 1 of this series. And then Act 2, the title of which is The Lost Older Brother, and Joe walked us through Act 2 last week. And if you missed those weeks, you gotta listen to them. They'll be helpful, and we'll kind of build off of them today. But the father is essentially rejected by both his sons. In large part This story is about the father's response to both his sons rejecting his love. In Act 1, the younger son goes to his dad and essentially says, hey, I want my inheritance and I want it now. The way Luke phrases it in verse 12 is, Father, give me my share of the estate. And this is a massive, massive slap in the face, just a huge offense to his dad. And you can understand. I mean, he's essentially saying, I want what's coming to me and I want it right now. I don't care if you live or die, but I want what I want and I want to get out of here. It's time to blow this pop stand. And the father, amazingly, the father grants his request. The younger son, he doesn't want anything to do with him. And the father allows him to make his choice. So he gives the younger son his share of the inheritance. And the son, he goes off to a distant country, somewhere far from home, and he just squanders everything he had. He just blows it on what Luke calls wild living. And he hits rock bottom, and he finds himself down in the mud, literally down in the pigsty. And he realizes how stupid and foolish he's been. And so he comes up with a plan. And his plan is, hey, first off, I realize I've been an idiot. And so I'm just going to go home and confess it all to my father. I'm just going to face the music in that way. And the second part of his plan is he'll ask his dad to make him like a hired servant. His little speech that he composes is, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Just make me like one of your hired servants. And he's thinking, listen, Dad, I know I can't be your son again, but maybe I can at least begin to pay back to you what I owe. Maybe I can pay some restitution over the long haul and repay at least a portion of what I blew. So he heads back home after being away for several years, and he wastes everything while he's away. And when he finally tops the hill to their house, his father sees him far off, and the father runs to his son, which was unheard of in that day. He runs to his son. He shows absolute emotional abandon, and he just kisses him over and over and over again. And the son, he tries to roll out this little restitution plan, but the father won't hear any of it. The dad says, get the best robe, and the best robe would have been the father's robe. He says, get the best robe, get the ring, put it on his finger, get shoes for his feet. I'm not going to wait for you to clean up. I'm not even going to wait for you to take a bath. And I'm certainly not going to wait for you to prove yourself. He says to his servants, cover my son's nakedness and rags with the robe of my office and the symbols of honor, and we're going to feast. You're not going to earn your way back, the father says. I'm bringing you back into the family. And then he says, kill the fatted calf, because we're going to throw a party for the whole village to come and for the whole world to know that this son of mine, he's home now. He was lost and now he's found. He was good as dead, but now he's alive. That's Act 1. And then Act 2 comes along, and it's focused on the older brother. And when the older brother hears about what's happened, he's furious. And he's particularly upset about the fatted calf being killed and the cost of this celebration, which might not be obvious to us what exactly is going on here. I don't know if this ever happened before. You may have heard about it, but there was this Sunday school teacher teaching on this story in their class, and the teacher says to the class on a Sunday morning to these little kids, says, there's one for whom the return of the younger son brings no joy and celebration. There's one who experiences only disappointment and bitterness and resentment. Who was it? And one of the kids raises their hand and says, the fatted calf. I don't know if it happened, but it should have. Have you noticed our graphic throughout this series? We were going for a cow with a surprised look on its face. So that's the idea we have behind this graphic. We thought about going with this option at one point. We laughed about that one there. We even created a bumper video. Check it out. We thought that was really funny. You may or may not. But listen, did you notice what a big deal this whole kill the fatted calf thing was? The older brother here says to a servant, what's going on? And the servant says, your younger brother's back, and your father gave him the calf. And the older brother says to the father, you gave him the calf? Why'd you give him the calf? I can't believe you gave him the calf. You never gave me the calf. You never even gave me a goat or a chicken or even a squirrel. Why'd you go and give him the calf? And we're sitting here reading this saying, I know this means something, but I'm not exactly sure why this is such a big deal. What is this all about? Well, Middle Eastern people in that time, they almost never had meat for a meal. It was a delicacy. And if you ever had meat, it was a party. But the greatest delicacy and the most expensive possible thing was to kill a fatted calf. The whole village would have been there, and it was ever so expensive. And therefore, the older brother is saying, how dare you use our wealth like this? I've obeyed you. I've been here. I should have some say in this. In other words, I have some right over your things. How dare you do this? And he just insults the father. Because there in verse 29, he doesn't say father when he addresses him. He says, look, which is a direct affront and a deliberate insult to his father. He doesn't give any address to the father whatsoever. He's basically saying, look, you. It's just an incredible insult. He publicly humiliates his father by not going into the greatest feast his father has ever thrown. His father has to come out to him. But what's the father do? I mean, how does the father respond? He responds with a very, very tender word in verse 31. He says, my son. Actually, it can be translated, my child. My child. I still want you at this feast. Even though you've insulted me and embarrassed me and every other father I know would have disowned you already for what you've just done, but I still want you in. I still want you at the party. And so we're kind of on the edge of our seats asking the question, well, how's it going to end? What will the older son do? Will, at the end of the day, the family come together in unity and love? I mean, how will the older brother respond? And Jesus ends the parable. He never tells us. It's kind of a cliffhanger. Now, why? And what's Jesus trying to get across? Well, there's a whole lot here, but a couple of things for us to take away today, and they're so very radical and possibly life-changing. First off, Jesus, in this parable, he clarifies God. He redefines God. You know, there are an awful lot of people who really, really struggle with this idea and concept in the Bible that God is a father. Realize, however, that Jesus, more than anyone, called God Father. He was the first person to address God as Father. And every single time, except for one, he ever addresses God in the Bible, he addresses him as Father. And he defines here what he means by Father. You know, a lot of people struggle with this because they say, I hate this idea of God. It's too patriarchal. You know, fathers are hard and they're harsh and they're condemning and they rule with control. And I want a loving God, a sensitive God, a forgiving God, a God who longs for relationship, a connection, and reconciliation. But Jesus gives us a father unlike any father of that time, easily. His emotional abandon, his generosity, his willingness to receive the agony of rejected love. Jesus is saying, look, I'm sorry a lot of you had fathers like that, but my father's not like that. For all of his power and authority and majesty, he's all these things too. See, he's loving, he's suffering, he's longing for your love, and he loves you. Jesus brought together traits and attributes the meekness and majesty of God, the power and tenderness of God, and said, that's who God is. This isn't a God who wants to squish you or keep score on you. And no one had ever described God in those ways. He redefines God. It was A.W. Tozer who wrote, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. We tend, by a secret law of the soul, to move toward our mental image of God. This is true not only of the individual Christian, but of the company of Christians that composes the church. Always, the most revealing thing about the church is her idea of God. And the idea, the picture we got of God here in Luke 15, that Jesus gives us in Luke 15, it's simply amazing. It's incredible. It's wonderful. He clarifies for us what God is like. Another thing Jesus does with this story is he clarifies sin. And this is brilliant what Jesus does here. I mean, in the first act, the younger brother act, Jesus gives us a picture of sin that's very traditional. I mean, anybody can look at that and say, yep, that's sin. parties and prostitutes, insulting his dad, pigsty, down in the gutter, self-indulgent. That's sin, all right. And we'd all agree. But then in the second act, the older brother act, he kind of turns the table. Because when you get to the end of the second act, this is what you're left with. There are two sons, and one is very, very good, and one is very, very bad. And they're both alienated from the father's heart. Each one of them wanted the father's things, but not the father. Each one of them, check this out, each one of them used the father to get what they really wanted. They didn't love the father. He was just a means to an end. They used the father. One of them did it by being very, very good, and one of them did it by being very, very bad. But they're both lost. The bad one's lost in his badness, and the good one is lost in his goodness. And in the end, it's the bad son that's saved, and the good son, as far as we know, at least where Jesus left the story, he's lost. And that goes against what everyone has ever believed. The lover of prostitutes is saved, and the man of moral rectitude is lost. And it gets worse, because when you see why the good son was lost, he's lost not in spite of his goodness, he's lost because of it. And he says as much in verse 29. He says there, here's the reason I won't go into the feast. Here's the reason I won't go to the party. Here's the reason that I reject you, Dad. I've never disobeyed you. That's what he says. It's not his sin that's keeping him from his father. It's his goodness. It's his righteousness. He's proud of his goodness. If you look back at the first two verses there in the 15th chapter of Luke, you'll see that there were two groups that were listening in when Jesus tells this story. Check it out. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Two groups listening in. They were the tax collectors and sinners, and then there were the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And now we know who these two guys in the parable are. Tax collectors, sinners, they're the younger brothers. They run off. They live any way they want. Pharisees and teachers of the law, moral people, religious people, they're the older brothers. Jesus is speaking right at his audience, and he's speaking to us as well. And what we have in front of us here are the two basic ways that human beings try to go about life and putting themselves right and connecting with God. See, the older brothers of our world, they divide the world into two. The good people are in, and the bad people, all of you out there, are out. And the younger brothers do as well. The self-discovery people, they divide the world into two. They say the open-minded, progressive people are in, and the narrow-minded people are out, all of you out there. And Jesus says, neither. It's the humble who are in, and the arrogant who are out. He says it's the people who realize they need sheer grace. They're the ones who are in. See, we got to sort through what the gospel of Jesus Christ really is, what the good news of Jesus is, what the message really is. It's not do what you want. What's it matter anyway? God's got to forgive you. And it's not be a good person because then God will accept you. We miss this, especially in our day today. There are two ways to try and control God and the people around you and your own life. And one is by going off and living any old way you want. And the other is by living a very, very moral, very religious life. But both are just trying to control God. We think if I love people and if I'm good and if I pray, then God's got to bless me. And you're just trying to control God in that way. If we're an older brother type, our morality, all our obedience is a way of getting God to give us what we really want. And it's not God himself. You believe you're owed. God owes you because you've been so good. But to come to a place where we obey God just to get God, to reflect him, to love him, to know him, to resemble him, to delight him, then we're getting somewhere. Older brother lostness and younger brother lostness, they're both lost either way. It's sin either way. See, even though Jesus doesn't resolve how the parable ends, he does resolve our solution, whether we're older brothers or younger brothers. And Jesus gets at it. Do you see how he talks about the initiating love of the Father? Did you notice that the father goes out to both sons in order to bring them in? He goes out running to the younger son, but he also goes out to the older son. And remember who Jesus is telling this story to. Pharisees, religious elite. He's not self-righteous to the self-righteous, and he's not a Pharisee to the Pharisees. He just seeks you. He might be seeking you right now, which may be why you're feeling the way that you feel today. It may be why you're tuning in today. What we need is to be melted and moved by what it cost to bring us home. And you might think, well, wait a minute, Dave. It didn't cost him anything. I mean, the kid came home with a desire to compensate, but the father wouldn't let him compensate, so it was free. It didn't cost him anything. Oh, it didn't cost him anything, but it cost somebody else a whole lot. And at the very end, Jesus kind of gives us a hint there. And the last verse, when the father says, everything I have is yours to the older son. That's literally true. Because the younger brother had liquidated and spent his inheritance. And now every single thing that the father had belonged to the older brother. I mean, every robe, every ring, every fatted calf belonged to the older brother. The younger brother could only be brought back into the family at the enormous cost and expense of the elder brother. It's not free. It's not simple to be saved. Somebody has to pay. The older brother has to pay. And he's furious about it. And what Jesus is doing here, I mean, he puts such a nasty older brother in, is he's showing the Pharisees what they look like. It's like he holds up a mirror to them and to us. But you know what a true older brother would have done? A true older brother would have seen the agony of the father and said, Dad, I'm going to go out and look for my brother. And if he's made a mess of himself and squandered all his inheritance, I'll bring him back. I'll bring him back even if it costs me, even at my own expense. That would have been a true older brother. But this poor kid in Jesus' story, the younger son, he didn't have a true older brother. But we do. Jesus Christ gives us a bad older brother in the story, so we'll long for the right one. And we don't need someone to go out from the next town to find us. We need someone to go from heaven to earth. We don't need an older brother who brings us into God's family just at the cost of his wallet, but at the cost of his life. See, because on the cross, Jesus Christ was stripped naked so that we could be clothed in the robe of honor that we don't deserve. On the cross, Jesus called my God, my God. It's the only time he didn't call him Father, because at that moment, he wasn't being treated as a son so that you and I could be. There he paid the debt that deep down we all know we owe. And because everything he had, I mean, he had everything that the Father had, and he shares it with us, and he brings us home at the enormous expense to himself. And when we see that, to the degree that we see that, it will change the absolute motivation. I mean, our whole approach to connecting with God. A lot of us would be younger brother types. And many younger brother types would say, the problem with the world is religion. It's the moralists, the self-righteousness. It's a big problem. And guess what? This parable says, Jesus says, well, you're right. But he also says, your self-discovery mode, doing whatever you want to do, hadn't been working real lately for you. And if you say that it is, just give it some time. It'll break down. It'll disappoint. It'll come up empty. It always does. And then what do? Well, you run to this Father. You realize you have a true older brother. This is the love that you need, like Jesus describes here. But a lot of us might be older brother types. And so for the older brothers, remember the way Jesus ends his story? And don't forget, Jesus is speaking to Pharisees, and he's basically inviting the older brothers to listen to this appeal and put themselves in, and to you and to me too, and just respond. It's participatory theater. And some of you are older brother types, and you've got an older brother type of heart. And so you're always mad. You're mad at those people who have hurt you, and you're mad because your life isn't going like you've imagined and hoped it would, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm the good one. And the main thing between you and God is your goodness. And you're mad at things, and you're mad at people, and you're mad at God because you've tried so hard and you've worked so hard, and you're frustrated. James Proctor wrote in that old hymn, lay your deadly goodness down at Jesus' feet. Stand in Him and Him alone, gloriously complete. We'll never stop being older brothers until we see and are melted by what our true older brother, Jesus, did for us. God's reckless grace is our greatest and only hope. For all our badness and for all our attempts at being good enough and coming up so very short, you are worse than you think you are. And so am I. And God is better than we think He is. And therein lies the place to rest. So we have some moments right now to be moved once again by the matchless grace of God through the celebration of communion, where we remember Jesus Christ, our true older brother, His body and blood given on the cross so we could be reunited with our true Father. So wherever you're watching this right now, gather up some bread and juice and remember Jesus through His death on the cross.
me from the raging sea, and I am safe on the solid ground. The Lord is my salvation. Will not fear when darkness falls. His strength will help me scale these walls. I'll see the dawn of the rising sun. The Lord is my salvation. Who is like the hidden in the Lord. He flowers each promise of His word. When winter fades, I know spring will come. The Lord is my salvation. Your kingdom forever will stand. We won't be shaken, we will not fear. Our God, a mighty warrior, you're a consuming fire. In victory you reign, we triumph in your name. Jesus, the great commander, you conquered death forever. In victory you reign, we triumph in your name. And we declare your name is power. Exalted one, no name is higher. You stand alone, our strong defender. Above you there's no other. Above you there's no other. And we declare your name is power. Exalted one, no name is higher. You stand alone, our strong defender. Above you there's no other. 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 Our God, a mighty warrior, you're a consuming fire. In victory you reign, we triumph in your name. Jesus, the great commander, you conquered death forever. In victory you reign, we triumph in your name. Our God, a mighty warrior, you're a consuming fire. In victory you reign, we triumph in your name. Jesus, the great commander, you conquered death forever. In victory you reign, we triumph in your name.
Thanks again for tuning in, everybody. If you'd like to support CCC's efforts to help people find their way back to God and give financially, you can text CCC White Marsh to 77977, or just head to communitycc.net and click the Give tab. There's also a chance coming up to support one of our community partners, the Araminta Freedom Initiative, by participating in a virtual race against traffic. It's a virtual 5K or 10K run, or a family fun walk, or my favorite option, the unrun. That's the couch to recliner option, totally my speed. Regardless of which race you choose, you'll be helping raise awareness about child sex trafficking right here in our area, and you'll be supporting Araminta's mission to end this injustice. I know it's been a pretty tough year. There's a lot going on in our world, and now more than ever, we're faced with things that can really send our thoughts into a spiral. I'm wondering if you could sit down and ask a counselor one thing that would help you, what would it be? Well, you'll have a chance to do that because next Sunday, May 2nd, CCC will have a professional counselor here. It's Ask a Counselor Sunday, and it's a chance to have a bunch of your questions answered. So go ahead and text your question to 410-849-6265. What would be helpful to hear a counselor talk about? Share your question. It'll guide what we talk about that day. Thanks again for tuning in. Be sure to say hi on social media @CommunityCC on all platforms, and we can stay connected all week long. See you next week, everybody.